Good evening, everybody. My name is Jana Weber. I coordinate the human rights and EU funding activities at the Friedrich Naumann Foundation here in Brussels in the Regional Europe office. And today I have the pleasure to welcome you to our event, Liberal Democracy Under Attack, the Radical Populist Wave and the Rise of Extremism in Europe, organized in cooperation with the Institut Francais and the University of Groningen. Honestly, I wish I could tell you that the European Union, since we all started coming together in like 1933, has managed to overcome all issues like populism and extremism. That would be a little bit of a wishful thinking. Of course, we do have to acknowledge the long way that we have come, the hard work that we have put in all together, and the many laws and regulations that the EU institutions and member states have passed that have made the EU already kind of a safe space in many aspects and for many people. However, the past decade has also especially shown us how crisis can sometimes at least seemingly set us back in this progress. Recent COVID-19 crisis has been a stark reminder that we cannot rest on goodwill resolutions and strongly worded letters, because while a big part of the European people came together in solidarity to tackle the pandemic and its consequences, we also saw an increase in hate and division, fueled largely by populism and disinformation. Now it's time to take the EU's commitment to protecting its people and promoting liberal democracies to the next level. And I'm very happy to see that there are many great EU strategies, for example, on disinformation and anti-Semitism, as I'm sure the following speaker, Mr. Herbert, will elaborate on further in a bit. But for now, I'll leave you with a couple of words about FNF's work, which is that promoting democracy, rule of law, and human rights is one of the core tasks of our work in Germany, Europe, and abroad. And this is very much involves highlighting issues around populism and extremism. I invite you to have a look at a publication that we released last year, in which we analyzed the ways in which 9 liberal parties deal with right-wing populists, actors across 5 European countries, namely Estonia, Finland, the Netherlands, Austria, and Sweden, of which today we're also going to talk about one of them. And also knowing that disinformation is an important tool for populists, we also support the very diverse civil society sector fighting disinformation with capacity building, analysis, and network building across Europe, together with our partner EU Disinfolab. I will share the links to the projects with you in the chat in a second. And if you have any questions, always feel free to reach out to us. But I've talked enough, and I know you're very much looking forward to the rest of the program. So I would hand over to Mr. Didier Herbert, the head of the representation of the European Commission in the Netherlands.
Thank you, Jana. Thank you very much. Bonjour, guten Tag, goeie avond. A long time ago, I was following a seminar of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation, Stiftung, and I heard someone saying, en français, la liberté de l'un s'arrête là où elle commence à heurter la liberté de l'autre. And I think it's, if it is a liberal value, I think it's also a fundamental wisdom. The European Union is based on a set of fundamental values. These values include respect for human dignity, freedom, including freedom to express your opinion, equality, but respect to human rights and to the rights of people belonging to minorities and majorities. These values characterize a society where pluralism, non-discrimination, and tolerance prevail. But what do we see? We see that in recent times, these values have come under strain. And we are convinced in the European Union, in the European Union institutions, that upholding these values and doing everything to uphold these values is not only useful, but also necessary, even essential. not only to protect the rights of people to belonging to or being perceived to belong to minorities, but also to safeguard the personal freedoms and rights from all people residing in Europe. There are fears and feelings of insecurity, especially when people feel a little bit losing control because they are in moments of social and economic transitions. Now, according to the findings of the Dutch Agency for Social Cultural Planning, we see polarization in society, in politics. And this polarization can take many forms, from expressing people's opinions to inciting to intolerance, to hate, maybe even to violence. Intermediaries can play a role to increase these intolerable, unacceptable things, or to mitigate what we see. And this is why the European Union and institutions that want to stand for its priorities and standing for democracy, protecting the European way of life, are two of the 6 priorities of the European Union. This is why the European Union and its institutions are taking different actions, a variety of actions towards companies, the digital transition, towards people, towards media, taking action against hate speech, taking action against disinformation, helping educating people and getting people to think about the consequences of what seems maybe harmless or innocent. And taking actions to curb evolutions in disrespect of these values towards specific groups. And this is the idea behind the first EU strategy on combating anti-Semitism and fostering Jewish life of last December of 2021. The idea is quite straightforward. There is a problem. The problem is acknowledged. Anti-Semitism is on the rise. And there are ways to curb these worrying developments through prevention and combating all forms of anti-Semitism, through protecting and fostering Jewish life in the EU, our variety of life in the EU, and through education and remembrance of how some things bad, really bad, or maybe seemingly starting as innocent behavior could develop and lead to totally bad things which are not, which we have seen and would not like to be repeated. This strategy shows a range of actions along these 3 themes. Actions that we advise member states to undertake, devise their own action plan, transpose the legal framework on combating racism, xenophobia, and prosecute hate speech against which have an anti-Semitic element, or actions that it will undertake itself. As Jana said, laws and regulations. But make no mistake, what the European Commission does is much more than just laws and regulations. How to cooperate between member states, how to cooperate with society, with industry, providing funding. So a vast action plan where a lot can be done by many people, by many elements of government. And the Commission will follow that, will coordinate that, and will report on it in 2024 and then 5 years later. Now, polarization, extremism, populism are putting our liberal democracy under attack. This is what we see in the invitation for today's panel. And our panel and discussion today with you, with a number of distinguished guests, organized by different institutes, by the Stiftung, and by the French presidency, and with a little bit of help of the representation, will put the spotlight on an evident but a difficult topic, on the situation, on the dangers, on the consequences. So I wish you a very fruitful discussion, and I would now give the floor to Léonie de Lange. Aan jou. Dank u.
Thank you, Didier. Good evening, everyone. It's great to see so many of you in the audience. I think there's over 60 of you in the room right now, so we have a big crowd gathered here tonight. And it is my great pleasure to serve as moderator during this webinar tonight. So my name is Léonie de Jonge. I am based at the University of Groningen, where I work as an assistant professor in European politics and society. And I'm very happy to see some of our students in the audience as well. So my research expertise is also on far-right parties, so I have a personal interest in this topic tonight. And I think the opening remarks that we just heard by Didier Herbert helped us set the scene for the discussion that we are leading tonight. I think the relevance of tonight's debate is clear. The rise of populist and extremist forces in Europe are posing an internal existential threat to Europe's liberal democracies. And of course, this raises a host of different questions. What are the resurging, the driving forces behind the resurgence of the far right? How can we tackle this phenomenon? And I'm therefore really excited that we have a stellar group of experts from academic and practitioner world who can give us some insights on what is actually happening on the ground, and notably by focusing on 3 case studies, including Poland, France, and the Netherlands. So what I'd like to do is I would like to start by introducing our 3 panelists first, and then I will ask all 3 of them to give a brief opening statement to kind of help us understand what's actually happening on the ground in the countries that they are experts on, and perhaps a bit beyond that. But let me start by first introducing our distinguished speakers. So first we have Anna Makówka-Kwapisiewicz. Anna is a historian, a journalist, and a social activist. She's also an expert in the field of social involvement and the protection of human rights. Since 2016, she has been working with the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs as a project coordinator for Poland, where she is implementing projects aimed at strengthening civic society organizations, as well as promoting citizens' participation, government transparency, and accountability. She has more than 17 years of experience in advocacy, promoting tolerance and shaping attitudes of openness towards national, ethnic, religious, and LGBTQ+ communities, with a particular focus on counteracting anti-Semitism and discrimination. She's also worked in various international organizations, or together with international organizations, I should say, including, just to name a few, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, but also the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights and the American Jewish Committee. She uses her experience as an anti-discrimination trainer and coach in educational activities. And from 2019 to 2021, she was a member of the steering committee of the European Network for Countering Antisemitism through Education, a pan-European network of international organizations and institutions that use education as a tool to counteract anti-Semitism. She's also the author of a new educational tool for countering anti-Semitism called Anti-Semitism is Not an Opinion, and was a member of the expert group that developed the so-called Stories That Move program, which are tools for counteracting discrimination using modern technology. So I'm really delighted that Anna is with us tonight, and she will really give us an expert point of view. Our second panelist is Jean-Yves Camus, who is joining us as director of the Observatoire des Radicalités Politiques at the Fondation Jean Jaurès. He's also an associate fellow at the Institut de Relations Internationales Stratégiques, both based in Paris, where he's joining us from tonight. He is an expert on contemporary extreme right movements in Europe and the history of the relations between Russia and radical nationalist movements in Western Europe, a very topical subject that I think will come up tonight as well, not just the internal threat, but also the external relations. And he has published widely on this topic. For instance, he contributed recently to a volume called Eurasianism and the European Far Right, Reshaping the Europe-Russia Relationship, edited by Marlène Laruelle. And he's also published a book entitled Far Right Politics in Europe with Nicolas Lebourg at Harvard University Press. And then last but not least, we move to Professor Lars Rensmann, who is a professor of European politics and society with me here at the Universiteit Groningen in the Netherlands, where he also serves as director of the Center for the Study of Democratic Cultures and Politics and the chair of the Department of Languages and European Languages and Cultures, where I also work. Prior to joining us here in Groningen, he held chair positions at various other prestigious universities, including in Rome and in Michigan. He has also held various research, teaching, and honorary appointments, including at Yale, Berkeley, Vienna, Haifa, and Berlin. And he has published widely on a range of very different topics, particularly relevant for tonight, I would say populism, authoritarianism, and anti-Semitism. His books include The Politics of Unreason, The Frankfurt School and the Origins of Anti-Semitism, which was published in 2017, as well as The Politics of Resentment, Anti-Semitism and Counter-Cosmopolitanism in the European Union. So very topical for tonight's debate as well. And from April, he will sadly be leaving us in Groningen. I say that very selfishly because he'll be leaving us here in Groningen, but he will be joining as Professor of Political Science and Comparative Government. He will be going to the University of Passau in Germany. All right, that is to get us all excited about what's to come. So we have really a stellar panel here with experts from academia, but also from the practitioner world. And I would love to hear from these experts. So before we get to the difficult questions that I have prepared for you, I would like to ask our panelists to get us started by providing us with a bit of a context on the current state of liberal democracy in their various countries of expertise. And I would like to ask people in the audience, if you have questions, to submit those through the Q&A forum, which will then come to me. So I will feed them to our panelists. So with no further ado, I would like to give the floor to Anna to start with Poland. Could you tell us a bit about what's happening in Poland at the moment?
So good evening. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. So in the terms of Poland in nowadays situation, of course, like we are facing the refugees crisis in the terms of war in Ukraine. So we are like, we are having right now 1,033,000 people. So trying to provide them shelter, and it's one of the biggest crises after the war. So as we are seeing, like, it's like the history makes its own circle. And as we were talking about polarization, when we are facing like polarization in Poland after the recent election, there was like one of the highest level of polarization in the terms of Polish society. So right now we are seeing like unbelievable unification in the terms of human dignity, protection of the human rights, and help towards those who are which that help really need. And that is what we are facing right now. So it's like we are doing our best like to help and to host those people as we can.
And could you perhaps also tell us a bit about the state of liberal democracy in general? What's happening in Poland at the moment? So just zooming out from what's happening at the moment to just a bit of the bigger context.
Yes, of course. So like to give you the general overview. So from 2015, we are like, we are facing the challenges in the terms of democracy, as like the Poland is, how to put it in the very political sensitive way, those liberals voices and or in the minority in the Polish parliament, And suddenly in the Polish parliament and political discourse in the terms of majority, suddenly there are the voices using polarization tools like anti-Semitism, homophobia, and everything which is affecting liberal values. So in that regard, like I was like recently I was doing the report in the terms of like anti-Semitism in the V4 countries, and what was very striking, like it's that's not only anti-Semitism is used as a tool gaining the voters, like the political the power, but also it's like it's this kind of homophobia, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism is very politicized, and suddenly it become like the tool which is affecting the and like it's used against those liberal agenda. So suddenly those who are like blamed to be Jews are very connected with so-called liberal values. So we are striking with such a phenomenon, which is like which was very visible and like noted by the OSCE, for example, like in the former presidential election when anti-Semitism was used, and like one of the candidates for the during the presidential election was accused of fulfillment of the Jewish needs, for example, right? So and also like the liberal voices in Slovakia and Czech Republic were like also called Jews because they were representing the liberal agenda. So that is what we are facing right now in Poland, to keep the long story short.
Yes, very, very useful, I think, and indeed a very serious democratic backsliding, but at the same time now a new crisis on top of that with the humanitarian situation that's developing in the east of Europe. Thank you very much, Anna. I would like to turn to Jean-Yves Camus to tell us what's happening in France, because France, of course, has elections coming up. So I'm curious to hear what is happening in France at the moment and what the state of liberal democracy is in France.
Good evening, everyone. So we have a presidential election on April 10th, second round on April 24th, with elections to the lower house of parliament slated for June 2022. So it's obviously the time to assess the strengths of liberal democracy. We used to think that liberal democracy relies on three political families: the Social Democrats, the Liberals, and the mainstream conservatives. Having a look at the polls today, I must admit that if this is a measure of the strength of liberal democracy, we are not doing very well. It's true that the incumbent president, Emmanuel Macron, is very much ahead of all candidates, probably polling more than 30% on the first round, and he will be elected with, I would say, close to 60%, if not more. But for the second place, that means the one who will qualify for opposing him on the second round, we have a far-left candidate who stands around 11–12%, and we have two far-right candidates. It's a debate whether we have to call them far-right, extreme right, or whatever. But nevertheless, if you add the vote for Marine Le Pen to the votes for Éric Zemmour, who is a newcomer to the political scene, that makes up around 30%. Around 30% of the vote, which is incredibly high. But what I want to add is that this is only part of the picture, because we also have a big problem with the level of trust in public institutions. The level of trust in political parties, for example, is very low. Only 16% of the French believe that political parties do something to do something positive. the trade unions have a positive opinion with 38%. The media are only trusted by 28%, and the political parties stand well below at 16%. Apart from that, we have a huge segment of the voters who do not bother anymore to vote. For example, we had elections to the regional councils and to the city councils in 2020 and 2021. It's true that those elections were held under very special circumstances because of the pandemic, but nevertheless, only less than 40% bothers to go and vote. So we do not know what will be the abstention rate for this presidential contest. Obviously, the French go to the polls pretty much when it comes to electing a president. I would say at this time, 65% of the French are sure to go and vote on April the 10th. That's pretty good, but that's only a guess. I mean, that's only a poll. And of course, the outcome of the elections will be very much affected by the number of people who do not go and vote. And it's a possibility that if the second round opposes Macron to Marine Le Pen, many of the left-wing voters, even the Social Democrats, will not bother to go and vote on the second ballot because they will say, oh, well, this is not a real choice. I mean, that's only a duplicate of what took place in 2017, and we do not want that anymore. And finally, just to give you some figures about anti-Semitism here, we had an increase in 2021 by 75% of anti-Semitic incidents, especially those which involve some kind of physical violence. It's a very interesting situation because only 1/3 of those offenders who committed an anti-Semitic attack say they perpetrated this because of the Israel-Palestine conflict. So it means that 2/3 of them are not really motivated by what's going on in the Middle East. It's some kind of a cultural prejudice against Jews that probably comes from education, that probably comes from their family background. But even when nothing really bad happens in the Middle East, we still have a very high level of incidents.
All right, thank you very much, Jean-Yves, for painting us the French picture and bringing us up to speed on what's happening there. And I already see interesting parallels with what's happening in Poland, but also some specificities to the French context. You mentioned the decline of mainstream parties, the rise of radical and extremist forces, and of course, the rise of anti-Semitism as well as the lack of trust or the decline in trust in institutions as such. So that is worrying and interesting at the same time. And I would like to go to Professor Rensmann to hear what the situation is in the Netherlands.
Yeah, first off, thank you, Léonie, for the nice introduction, and of course, Monsieur Charrier and the Institut Francais and the Naumann Stiftung for hosting this. I will say a few things about the Netherlands, but situated also in this larger European context, which is of our concern. And I can pick up the thread from Jean-Yves Camus to say that we are dealing not just with extremist forces or agents, but also structural problems in liberal democracy. So basically, these agents and structural factors do go hand in hand. And it is to many clear that the rise of populist parties and the partly in some cases and also in the Netherlands quite dramatic party system transformations. That is also true for the Netherlands with the Social Democrats and the socialist forces and centrist forces on the decline, and also populist forces, new populist forces on the rise. That liberal democracy also in the Netherlands, as in Europe almost everywhere, faces a structural crisis, a legitimacy crisis. It faces a party system crisis we've heard about. It faces crisis of institutional trust, even though in the Netherlands, clearly not as high and as dramatic as just portrayed in France. and also different, of course, from the Polish case. So we don't have a populist party in government. But there's clearly a crisis of representation, a crisis of input legitimacy, that people feel that their voices, their positions, their views are not heard. So they're turning to non-voting, or they're turning to populist or new challenger parties. What we don't have is a crisis of political participation. Because political participation is not just expressed through voting, which is considerably higher than in the Netherlands than in France, for example, but it's also, of course, articulated through social media and other forms of political articulations. And people actually participate much more in political debate actively than, let's say, a decade or 2 decades ago. Now that, to some extent, of course, is, and that's my second point, also can be a problem, because it goes hand in hand or marches in step with the digital, what I call the digital structural transformation of the public sphere, that basically social networks are the main agents of disseminating information, or the main resource also of information, which very often is actually a resource of disinformation or misinformation. And so we see divisions and political polarizations that are enhanced, engendered by a coarsening of public discourse, and fake news, hate speech, misinformation, and also the spread of conspiracy myths, which very often it's only a very small step from conspiracy myths to outright anti-Semitism. They're historically and currently intimately related. So the spread of disinformation, of misinformation, does harm to the legitimacy of the system, coarsens the political discourse, allows the spread of hate speech and extremist forces to rise. And the big problem of that is then that there's a general distinction also in public debate, and very much so in the Netherlands, between that people don't distinguish anymore between factual truths or facts and opinions. So they think like whatever you say about the Holocaust, about history, about Jews, about anything, about Russia, it's just a matter of different narratives, different frames, different opinions, rather than saying, well, something is a fact and it needs to be distinguished from an opinion. It brings me to my third point, to actors in this process of this attack against liberal democracy. And of course, prominently featuring here right-wing populist actors. In the Dutch case, that's predominantly the PVV, the Partij voor de Vrijheid, which is a party that has been in parliament for a long time. In fact, Geert Wilders is the second longest serving member of parliament, and a newcomer, a new challenger party, the Forum for Democratie, only a few years old, headed by Thierry Baudet, which is populist bordering to alt-right, right-wing extremists. And these parties, and particularly also the new Forum, is one of those agents of fake news and disinformation, active agents of disinformation, active agent of hate speech that contributes to the coarsening of political discourse, that contributes to political polarization, that tears our liberal democracies apart to some extent. The Forum for Democracy, with a single issue Corona campaign or anti-Corona, anti-hygiene campaign, has quadrupled its seats in the 2021 elections in the Netherlands. And so kind of boosted even with fake news about science, or science denialism, as I call it, its standing. And it also spreads conspiracy myths, and does so even in parliament. Fourth element then related to that is new movements that are coming up challenging liberal democracy, including the Corona denialists that very often actually invoke freedom and constitutional rights, also in the Dutch case, but elsewhere, particularly in Germany, Switzerland, and Austria as well, strongly, in the name of freedom and the constitution, which usually they don't really refer to very much. They spread half-truths, disinformation, and of course, once again, using social networks. And that is a major challenge. As I want to keep my initial statement short, there are also, of course, Islamist movements that are continuously growing. They're a big problem in France. They are not as such a big problem in Poland. They are also a big problem in the Netherlands. And finally, as we're talking here on this evening, after almost 2 weeks of a Russian war, an agent in this extremism, an active agent in this extremism, as already has been briefly mentioned so far, in the spread of disinformation, in election meddling, also in the Netherlands, but also in the US and elsewhere in Europe, in the funding of extremist forces, the funding and building of alliances and lobbying with radical right and radical right populist forces in France, of course, the funding of Le Pen, the closeness of Zemmour to Putin and others. Thierry Baudet is the most extreme case, arguably, of that Putinism, who even in this crisis, even as bombs are falling on the Ukraine through the Putin government and the war of aggression that we see, Thierry Baudet has called Putin an epitome of mildness, who is basically just acting in defense against a Western aggression, whereas the European Union allegedly launches a world war project. These are the words of Thierry Baudet, the leader of the Forum for Democracy, with 8 seats in the Dutch parliament. He's like, even in at this moment, is still as other Putin lovers and sympathizers and defenders are kind of falling and regretting and turning around, including Matteo Salvini. Thierry Baudet holds strong with his Putinist support and the extremism that has been supported by Russian disinformation and using social networks. So that's for our initial statement. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. There was a very rich introduction and a lot of things to pick up on. One thing I would like to pick up on right away is it ties in nicely to a question that was posed by someone in the audience. Thomas is asking, is it a coincidence that populists in Europe like Salvini and Le Pen are, or to some extent were, Putin cheerleaders, or is there some ulterior reason behind this? And I would like to ask Jean-Yves Camus this question, because you've written about this and thought about this for a while. Could you follow up on what Professor Rensmann was saying?
Well, in fact, if you look at French history, recent French history, you'll see that Le Pen is close to Russia, used to be close to, I mean, at least until the start of the present-day crisis. But we also have to look at the 1960s and 70s. Why? Because when I was a kid, that was in 1965, I remember General de Gaulle taking the very important step to withdraw France from the military command of NATO. And why did he do that? Well, because he had a very specific foreign policy of trying not to be aligned with any of the blocs. He wanted to, I would say, embody some kind of a third way between the United States and the USSR. And that left a legacy on the mainstream conservative right. Maybe you have followed the news and seen that the former Prime Minister, François Fillon, who is a mainstream conservative and was the candidate of the mainstream conservative right in 2017, waited about 1 week before saying, okay, I agree to withdraw from the board of those Russian companies I sit on. And there was really strong pressure for him to, I would say, withdraw, but he did not withdraw because he said Putin acted badly against the Ukraine. He withdrew simply because there was pressure from his own political party and from the media. There's a long history of the conservative right being close to Russia. And my personal feeling is that, in fact, since, I would say, 2007, since Sarkozy, the former president, decided that France should join the military command again, well, there's been one part of the mainstream conservative right who said, okay, so we have to stand by NATO in the United States, but there's also a very significant wing of the conservative right who say, no, this is wrong. And I mean, within the Républicains, which is a mainstream conservative party, there are many close friends of Russia just because of the Gaullist legacy. So Putin, in fact, did not really endorse Le Pen until François Fillon was so low in the polls in 2017 that obviously he was not in a capacity to win anymore. But he was very happy with some of the former prime ministers, and he was very happy with part of the conservative right as well.
So I think to answer Thomas's question, it's not a coincidence that these people are fans of Putin, but Jean-Yves Camus is explaining that it's very much strategic alliance. I would like to ask Lars if you could say if there's also something like an ideological alliance between far-right forces in Western Europe and yes. Putin. And then I would like to ask Anna about Central and Eastern Europe and Putin.
Yeah, absolutely. I would actually emphasize that, of course, there's always, as in politics, a question of the historical legacy that Jean-Yves Camus just mentioned, these historical alliances and skepticism towards the Western alliance in the French case. But there's, of course, also corruption at place. We see that mainstream forces very much of the political scene in various countries collaborate, not so much for ideological reasons, but simply, for example, Gerhard Schröder, who's also the German politician who's still actually on the boards of all these major Russian energy companies. But a big factor is this, what you just mentioned in the far right, that this is an ideological admiration, ideological affinity towards a strong leader who over the years, particularly over the last 10 years, has promoted a kind of Russian nationalism, and that is very attractive to national populists and the far right all over Europe, promoting allegedly Christian and family values, including homophobia. That's very much pushed within the legislation. So in that sense, that's also a model, including a sense of white supremacy and aggressive ethnic nationalism. That is a model and an ideological affinity to the far right in general. But also, let me add that, an anti-Western self-understanding of creating a new Eurasian power that provides generally a counter model to what is perceived by Putin and his ideologues, like Dugin, that needs to be an so-called Eurasian anti-Western alternative to what has been perceived as Western decadence, Western liberalism, the failing model of Western liberal democracy. And so here we are at liberal democracy under attack. This is part, of course, of the major attack that liberal democracy is facing. So we're seeing it in a way playing out right now with this war. This is part of a years building up of Russian, Eurasian, great power fantasies in Russia, and that has received like a lot of admiration for these ideological reasons, ideological affinities among the far right. But of course, at a certain point, when this war is getting close to Europe, for a lot of people in the far right, it's getting scary because a lot of people are actually breaking away from Putinism at this moment, as we possibly see a moment of overreach, a military overreach, and so there is a change in the making. But the ideological affinities are clear cut that have evolved over the last decade.
Thank you. So we see clear ideological and strategic alliances between far-right forces in Western Europe and Putin in Russia. What is it like in Central Europe and in Poland in particular? Anna, you mentioned that there was a humanitarian unification at the moment, but how does the political situation and the relationship with Putin play out in Poland?
So in terms like I just would like to go back a little bit. There was a fantastic report and publication created by Eniko Felix, connected with Tom Lantos Institute from Hungary. And she did the comparison between Polish and Hungarian far rights. And unfortunately, the correlation was very visible. And like there were the links also with Putin. Experts are saying that Polish far right is supported by Putin. It's visible correlation with some kind of admiration of this kind of far right agenda in the terms of values. When the problems are not being solved, and suddenly like there is no one shared value, and the value and the human rights suddenly are treated as a threat to this white supremacy Catholic values. So what is very interesting in the terms of ongoing crisis in Ukraine, there is the far right party, which is the part of the Polish parliament, like their official statement is trying to not even mentioning the Putin, but rather they are focusing on the humanitarian aid and trying like to find explanation why Poland should host refugees. So of course they are like those key actors from their political agenda, which are they saying what they are, but like they are trying to be quiet and rather not visible in that regard nowadays. But I would say it's very like similar as it was mentioned before.
Interesting. So a lot of distraction actually happening from the actual close ideological and strategic ties into focusing on the humanitarian dimension. But I'm sure these questions that you mentioned will pop up again later. There's no way around them at some point. I would like to invite the audience to keep sending in questions through the chat. We have a lot of interesting questions coming in. Before we turn to questions that go towards how to solve these multifaceted issues that you've been painting in the various countries and perhaps also at a European level, I would like to ask whether what we are seeing at the moment is new. So is the rise of populism, radicalism, anti-Semitism, is this new, or is there something specific to the time in which we're living that, are we reliving the past, or is what we're seeing really something new that is a reflection of our time that we're living in? Perhaps Professor Rensmann could comment on this first.
Well, that's it's always difficult to say, like, we're just reliving the past, because we're never reliving the past. The history is always in one way or another a new configuration, which, but of course, there are also cycles, there are also processes, and liberal democracy is not under attack for the first time. There are attacks on liberal democracy that have historical precedents, and we also see that actually some of these agents, including the far-right agents, they actually mobilize historical tropes and resources, and that includes anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism, I would never speak of a new anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism becomes modernized in various fashions, but it's a trajectory that is very, very old. And as I said, conspiracy myths always had a comeback in the history, and particularly so in conditions of modern society and political modernity. And conspiracy myths, which are easy tools to explain by personifying complex social problems and conflicts of the modern world. Anti-Semitism comes here as a very handy historical matrix that is then mobilized time and again. And so in a period of massive transformations, we undoubtedly have seen them since the 1990s, since the end of the Cold War, politically, since this age of new globalization, massive transformations that we've seen socially, digitally, in the public sphere. It's not, in that sense, a coincidence that also conspiracy myths are on the rise, and that there are challenges to liberal democracy. And many political scientists, political science scholars, I think, were rather over-optimistic in the 90s and 2000s by thinking that democratization is just this one-way street that will no longer face any challenges. And researchers on the extreme right have seen that for the longest time there has been a silent counter-revolution in the making that has become now quite noisy and loud counter-revolution in various ways against liberal democracy and the rise. We see the rise of authoritarian movements of various kinds, and I mentioned them before, from radical right movements to new movements challenging liberal democracy, but also to Islamist configurations, all challenging in some kind of nostalgic exclusivist fashion, the inclusive model of liberal democracy. So there are new elements, but of course there's also a historical trajectory that sometimes is actively replicated or functions as a resource in current political debates.
So clearly some new elements, but also strong historical trajectories. Jean-Yves Camus, do you agree with this assessment?
I totally agree, but I would like to stress maybe what is not new. What is not new in the case of my country, and I know this will, what I say now as probably not the opinion of all my colleagues, but I think that we in France have not really overcome the big divide of the French Revolution. The official narrative is that liberal values are accepted by the overwhelming majority of the French people. It's in fact the official narrative. I mean, our constitution relies on liberal values, and all governments accepted between 1940 and 1944 have always said that they stood by those values of 1789. But nevertheless, if you have a very close look, you'll see that a part of the population is still in some kind of a pre-modern set of values, and has not really become convinced by the fact that, well, we have to live in a liberal democracy. The second thing is, if you look, for example, at what seems new to us today, the Great Replacement theory, which comes from my namesake, Renaud Camus, who is a French writer. Well, back in the 1890s and at the start of the 20th century, there was a very, very famous writer who sold hundreds of thousands of copies in France, who was a member of the lower house of parliament and a high-ranked military leader, whose name was Colonel Drian. He wrote two books. The first one, in 1894, was, the title was L'Invasion Noire, which means the invasion of black people. The second one was published shortly before the First World War, and the title was L'Invasion Jaune, the invasion of yellow people. And in those two books, which were very widely sold at newsstands, you have the Great Replacement theory that, well, someday those people from the south or from the east, those people from our colonies will say, okay, we have to get free, first of all, and we have to invade the land of those who colonized us. So the Great Replacement theory is in fact not that new. So those were two elements of, I would say, tradition and history on the very long term that I wanted to stress.
Very helpful. Anna, you've worked as a human rights activist for 17 years. Do you also see some patterns that are recurring, or do you see some new elements?
But I'm also finishing my PhD in the terms of politicization of Holocaust. So maybe I would add something which might be interesting in terms of before. So I would say that in the terms of Europe, we can say that that anti-Semitism is rooted in the culture, and with because of the religion. So anti-Semitism was used in the terms of Christianization of the people during the spread of the Christianity in those areas. Like Jews were treated as the devils who will come to because they killed the Messiah, etc., etc. So like the anti-Semitism is rooted within the community, and it's like when it is used, it resonates. So it's like the easy tool which might be picked up under certain times and certain issues. What is very interesting in the terms of before, the experts which are trying to analyze the anti-Semitism in those 4 countries, or saying that we need to change the approach when we are trying to analyze the anti-Semitism and approach towards anti-Semitism in the terms of combating anti-Semitism. Then here, anti-Semitism, it's not only the old anti-Semitism which is affecting the Jewish community itself, but it's very politicized, and the Holocaust especially the Holocaust denial and the Holocaust distortion is used during the political campaigns, during presidential campaigns. One of the far-right party during the elections to the European Parliament used only anti-Semitic cliches, and during a few months they've got like almost 15% of support among young people. So it was very disturbing. In the end, thankfully, they did not made it, but like it shows something like the aspect of the how the community is perceiving them. They used the bill number 447, which was connected with the restitution process. So as you can see, it resonates because it is the part of the history which is unsolved, right, in the terms of Poland and the Holocaust. So I would say in that regard, that is very interesting. And the research made by the Polish Ombudsman 2 years ago, as I recall, in the terms of the hatred, the results were very interesting, that the young Poles, there is a gender difference, that the young Polish women are much more open, but they are much more educated, but like the radicalization is among those young Polish men. So that is disturbing because they are like in favor of those far-right movements. So that is the Polish situation.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we are seeing some interesting patterns and similarities across our case studies. One thing I'm going to use now to segue into some of the questions that are coming in through the chat. One thing that unites all of the far-right cases that we've discussed is the anti-Semitism. And one of the questions that is coming in the chat from Lauren is, how can we actually reconcile the fact that nationalists are increasingly cooperating at the international level? Isn't that ironic or somehow hypocritical that we see a nationalist international forming between these far-right forces in the various countries? Could you perhaps comment on this? Lars, perhaps you would like to start?
Sure. Yeah, this has been something that has been in the making. There are a few studies out now, particularly how on this kind of transnational, this new type of coalition building that takes place among far-right nationalist, authoritarian nationalist groups, parties, and movements. And there are a few studies out there exploring this more. It entails a few components in this globalized world in which we live in. One is a concerted effort to actually organize, deliberately organize themselves. You might call it hypocritical. Well, it definitely, there is a baggage there. In the past, it was very difficult for the extreme right for this very reason of nationalist conflicts. Let's talk about South Tyrol, for example. That was always kind of the end of the debate, and so meetings and organizational efforts failed on some of these territorial conflicts, which are dear to those nationalists. But in the past, that has changed with the modernization of these right-wing, radical right populist movements. There has been a a concerted organizing effort, but there's also, of course, transnational learning effects. Right-wing populist actors see what works in election campaigns, in other campaigns, in mobilizations, and that gains support, and what doesn't work, how to act in parliament, how to provoke politicians. There is now much more of a transnational learning where agents see that we can benefit from others, learning from strategies. A big boost was in 2016, the Trump election for radical right-wing populists, and so there is this kind of transnational dimension now. But there are also still certainly problems. It's not that one joining factor apart from anti-Semitism or the fact that all of these agents and actors are somewhat nationalist actually has been Putin. Most of these movements have been, with the exception of a few neo-Nazi groups, most of the far-right electorally relevant far-right movements who are promoting illiberal democracy and attack liberal democracy have been close to Putin in one way or the other. Financially, concrete matters, or with making a public statement like Matteo Salvini with his Putin shirt, or building alliances like the German Alternative for Germany, which signed a cooperation agreement with United Russia and so forth. So that is another common denominator, but there are also still internal problems when it comes to the vision of how this kind of Europe of nations is supposed to look, and the territorial aggressions, because ultimately ethnic nationalism always has a surplus to overreach and go beyond one's border, and then the conflicts also among these far-right groups are going to restart again.
You mentioned also Trump in your response. Jean-Yves Camus, could you perhaps also comment on this? Because Léonie is asking, did the Trump administration have an impact on the far right in Europe? And in what ways did the US administration perhaps change the state of democracy in Europe? Are we seeing some repercussions of the Trump administration in Europe?
Well, it's a very strange situation, because many parties on the far right are in fact very anti-US. For the neo-Nazis and the neo-fascists, the United States is the country which is responsible for crushing the Axis powers in 1945. For many others, the United States is the symbol of big money, big banks, of the melting pot, the multicultural society, multiracial society, so they do not see anything good. And on the other hand, it's true that when Donald Trump was elected, there was not only interest, some kind of joy with Trump being elected. And many of those parties, including people within the National Rally in France, say, wow, he's one of us. But in fact, I mean, first of all, those parties did not know much about the American political scene, and probably made, I would say, mistakes in understanding US politics. The second thing is, the National Rally, for example, sung praise for Trump, but Trump totally ignores him. When Marine Le Pen came to New York City and tried to meet with Donald Trump, she went to the Trump Tower. And in fact, she had to stay in the lobby of the Trump Tower for a whole afternoon. And at the end of the afternoon, there was a guy coming down from Trump's office telling her, okay, he will not ask you, you will not see him. So it's a very, but it's not a symmetric situation. Singing praise of Trump does not mean that Trump will support you. And actually, I see very few parties in Western Europe getting money from ultra-conservatives in the United States. which are only interested in getting Trump re-elected. On the other hand, it's true that, having some kind of an international of nationalists is something strange, might look strange, but you have to keep in mind that in each and every parliament in the world, and that includes the European Parliament, you have to have a faction. You have to, in the EU Parliament, you have the Social Democrats, the Conservatives, the Liberals. So you have to have a group. You have to have a faction. Why? Because you have money from the EU. You have floor time for your members of Parliament. You have staff. You have many opportunities. And if you want to look as big as the mainstream conservative right, you have to unite. That doesn't mean that you agree on anything, really. It just means that you're pragmatic. You say, well, we're sitting on the same benches. If we want to have more floor time, if we want to have staff members who can work on national policies from Brussels, and get the money from get the funding from the EU, let's do this.
So we've talked a lot about the strategic alliances indeed, and that it's sometimes quite opportunistic, these alliances that we're seeing. We've talked about the causes of this, as well as the historical roots of some of the phenomenon we're seeing at the moment. I would like to turn our discussions perhaps to some of the solutions that we can see to this, and some of the responses also to what we're seeing at the moment. And we have one question that is particular about the role of education, and specifically higher education, in all of this, and whether education can actually help us tackle this. Is it true that higher education does encourage more liberal values, and to what extent can education be a solution to this? And we have an expert on this particular question in our panel. So Anna, could you perhaps tell us what role education plays in this?
I would even start from the kindergarten, honestly, like the sooner the better. So of course we have the resolution, we have the recommendation in the terms of education, but on the different levels. And of course, like the countries which are like the members countries of European Union are implementing those. But the question is like how and what is written between the lines, like who is creating those manuals, who is creating the curriculum? Is the process transparent? Like there was the research done by the Globsec, and what they've proved that 25% of the teachers, of course, like the methodology of the research was quite complicated, but like the research is very interesting. So the results were that 25% of the teachers were in favor of far-right party. So even though that we have like good curriculum, like the question is who is teaching our kids. So that is a problem, like what kind of the textbooks are created, like what is like the, if we are seeing the implication from the like the mainstream narrative, like who is creating this narrative, who is in charge of education, who is like giving the credibility towards those who are creating those manuals, right? So, and the question is if we as a civil society, we as the academics can just influence the process itself. Of course, like the higher education should be, and it's supposed to be independent, but how we are perceiving this this process during the situation when we are when we are facing the challenges in the terms of democracy. So what I was like implementing the program, which took like almost 2 years. We've hired almost like 50 scholars. We were analyzing the textbooks, how and what they're writing about the minorities. And I know that like similar research were done in Hungary and Slovakia and in Czech Republic. And the consensus, like the results are, they were like more or less the same, that it's very like, narrow agenda, like very mainstream, religion oriented. In the Polish example, it was like there is one creation of the nation. There is one example of the Pole, which is like white, Catholic, and heterosexual. In other groups of the people, or rather others, and they are like the newcomers, those who are not creating the so-called of the like the motherland. So they are like the part of the heritage is like only white and Catholic. So that is very disturbing. And the question is if we are giving the space for the critical thinking and the critical education. Unfortunately not.
So there's really more need for education, and starting from kindergarten level onwards, you would argue, to tackle this. That's good news, I guess, for educators, but I think there's a lot to be done still. There is a specific question that is directed at Professor Rensmann that kind of ties into this when we talk about the solution of this, because there's a question about to what extent should we be taking the grievances that people have seriously? So should perhaps some of the solution to what we're seeing at the moment be related to addressing the real problems that people are facing, such as inequality, such as economic stagnation? Shouldn't we make a difference between the demand side, as it were, and the supply side, so the parties themselves and the people who are affected by this? Lars, perhaps you could answer this.
Sure. Yeah, it's something that we haven't addressed yet. Clearly, there are groups, when we take the look at the whole picture of the demand side, which are difficult to reach, or to some extent ideologized and out of reach. I always say that it's very difficult for populist parties to lose, even though even if they do display incompetence or incompetent governments, because their basis is basically is on an anti-pluralistic, they're grounded in an anti-pluralistic discourse that is somewhat detached from reality. But it's very easy for a democratic party to lose by making bad policies. So their policy making matters. And there's of course a whole there are many people in society who have become or have been have lost trust in institutions, as they feel they're no longer serving them. They no longer feel that their voices are heard. They also do not deliver the economic goods that they expect from a functioning democracy. And also, of course, a just society or economic justice and equality is also part of a functioning democracy. And we've seen a lot of historical cases of that. Studies by historians and political scientists that show that extreme wealth disequilibriums or disparities are actually harmful to the survival of democracy as much as the post-truth condition is harmful to democracy. So indeed, it is important, and it's much more important. And I think we do see here also, to some extent, a turning point in the debate about social and societal and economic grievances to address economic grievances. There are massive grievances. There's a housing crisis that many in policymakers in Western Europe have underestimated for the longest time. There is a welfare state regress crisis, and the mantra of neoliberalism. There was economic neoliberalism. We need to distinguish here from liberal values in the cultural and political sphere. Have to some extent, furthered this welfare state regress, and a lot of people feel that they're excluded from society, and that is not good. And this is in the long run undermining trust in institutions and undermining liberal democracy. So yes, we need to address that, while having in mind that also some people might be, for various reasons, out of reach, and it's not a direct causal relationship between economic economic problems and voting for anti-democratic or illiberal parties. That's not the case, but it definitely feeds into a sense of democracy is not working, our society is not working, and it feeds into this legitimacy crisis that also undermines the robustness of liberal democratic defenses against illiberal attacks.
So we have now, for the solution, education, which is important, but also tackling the root causes of all of this. Then there is a question about political parties, and you already mentioned the role of political parties in all this, but there is one particular for the French case. Jean-Yves, could you comment on the role of left-wing parties? And the question here is there perhaps from the left-wing parties some sort of a reluctance to address anti-Semitism in society because it involves violence from one minority against another, so from Islamist minorities against Jews, in particular, this question?
Well, it has become a problem since the start of the Second Intifada. In the history of the French Social Democrats, there's a very strong tradition of standing by the State of Israel and having Jews among the leadership of the party who are, I would say, supportive of Israel and of the right of a Jewish state to exist. And it suddenly changed after the start of the Second Intifada, when, I would say, part of the Social Democrats and, of course, the far left party had this strategy of saying, okay, the Jewish electorate, the Jewish voters are now overwhelmingly voting for the Conservatives, not because they are Jewish, in fact, but because of, I would say, they are belonging to the upper middle class. So many left-wingers said, we have to look at the potential of voters we have among the immigrants from a Muslim cultural background from North African countries mostly. And we have to listen to what they have to say about the issue of the Middle Eastern conflict. And as a result, a significant segment of the far left and of the Social Democrats have become aligned with a kind of anti-Zionism that often borders on at least the refusal to allow the Jews to have their own state. It has become so much of a divide that the anti-racist movement in France, which was quite united and very active in the 1980s and 1990s, has totally disappeared from the scene. I mean, the Second Intifada and the rise of anti-Semitism from the, well, I have to say, from people with a Muslim background, have totally torn apart the anti-racist movement so much that today it's very, very hard, if not really impossible, to see all those NGOs who claim to be anti-racist share a common platform against hate.
Yeah, that's deeply worrying, I would say, and also an interesting development happening. You mentioned already a bit talking about answers to this whole conundrum, and I'm trying to sort of move towards the end of this, and there are so many questions still, so but we don't want Jean-Yves to have to sleep in his office. So I have a question about the role of the EU's institutions in tackling this, and there's a specific question about Poland, because to what extent can the EU successfully support important humanitarian efforts that are happening in Poland on the ground at the moment? Can the EU play a role in strengthening sort of ground bottom-up responses, specifically in Poland, but perhaps also more generally? I think this one is directed at Anna.
So I like everyone is counting on it, honestly. So they are like the voices from the civil society in the terms of convincing European Union to make much more emphasis on education. Like in the terms of like education, like the country's member states are quite independent in that regards, like they need to fulfill the requirement, and then like they are doing their best to fulfill the recommendations. But like on the other hand, like analyzing who is in charge of education department, who is in charge of the Ministry of Education. It would be very fruitful to change the situation, ongoing situation. So in the terms of ongoing crisis, like everyone, like the experts are saying that that it might solve some of the problems which we are facing right now.
Thank you for this response to the Polish situation. What about social media? So I think this is one that Lars could really answer. So there's a question about to what extent should we be regulating social media? Think about platforms such as YouTube, Facebook, and others to stop radicalization and people ending up in vicious circles and making up. And what role does the EU in particular play in this regulation?
Yeah, I think the EU plays a very important role. And I remember just 3 years ago when I talked to people at the European Commission, when there was a strong reluctance and the experts there said, like, oh, we can only tweak a little bit vis-a-vis the big corporations. And I have to say this has changed. I see a lot of turning points. I already mentioned the big turning point that there's an emerging consensus in Europe to move away from radical deregulation and neoliberalism, that actually we need to create more robust societies that also provide for the citizens to not gamble away our institutional trust on the European level and on the national level. I see a turning point in tackling the situation with hate speech on social media, and a lot of things have already been done, more in the making, more legislations in the making, more cooperation with these with corporations, and the social media platform is in the making. So there are more and more initiatives to see that there is a responsibility. These are not just places of free dialogue, but there's a responsibility, just as other media, established old style media, have a responsibility. There's also a responsibility of networks. So we see a turning point there also on the European Union level. We also, I think we are seeing right now, so we see this disinformation turning point. We see a turning point in addressing anti-Semitism. This is much more on the agenda to actually address hate speech and anti-Semitism. And we finally also see right now at this moment a turning point in dealing with one of the biggest agents of disinformation, and that is Russia. European Union has completely changed its position vis-a-vis Russia. And I don't think, however this war will continue to unfold, that we will ever go back to this kind of looking away attitude in any of these countries that we mentioned, including France and including the Netherlands. There will be no way back. So we do see turning points, and that's why I can also finish on a hopeful note here today.
I always don't want to go over that because that is such a nice way to end, but I would like to offer the opportunity to our other two panelists to also have a closing statement or some sort of outlook for the future. Perhaps first Jean-Yves Camus, before you have to leave.
Yes, what I want to say is that combating hate online is a priority of the French presidency of the EU, and I must commend all government for putting this on the agenda. Nevertheless, as you probably know, we're not the only one to decide. I mean, most of the providers are located in the United States, where freedom of speech is understood in a very different way. So it will probably take some time before providers realize that in fact they do not get money from promoting hate speech or letting hate speech go, but they will have to lose money and to lose, I would say, some of their image at some point, to really understand that, I mean, what's going on social media is not only on social media. An anti-Semitic tweet or an anti-Semitic post on Facebook can trigger something that happens in real life. It's not only online, it can have consequences in real life.
So the online-offline debate is not really a separate debate. These two feed into each other, these two worlds.
Yes, according to me, yeah.
Anna, would you like to, do you also have some closing statements or some remarks?
So I would, like in the terms of hatred in the social media, like it's causes like a lot of symptoms, like chilling effects between among the women active, political active, like it's like the backlash in the terms of like traumatizing Jewish community and in other vulnerable groups like Roma community, LGBT community. So when we were analyzing the advocacy efforts among the civil society groups, like the biggest and most successful were the far-right organization. So I guess those representing liberal voices should learn the lesson and like get much more united, and like the component of coalition building would very like fulfill the gap and like will change the discourse of those conflict resolution, and will change the manager of those conflicts in the terms of polarization. So I would say.
Thank you. So learning perhaps some of the strategies of what the far right has been doing so successfully, and reminding everyone about why we actually need to protect liberal democracy, and how to do so, build a united front and do so. With that, I would like to thank all of our panelists for their fantastic input for tonight. I would also like to thank the organizers for putting this together, and of course, all of those of you in the audience who stuck with us, who asked questions. And I'm sorry to the questions we didn't get to. There are still a few that are not answered, but I would like to encourage each and every one of you to continue asking those questions to yourselves, to at your universities and your daily lives about how we can tackle these challenges that we are facing at the moment. And last but not least, it is my great pleasure to ask you to also fill in the survey that the European Dialogue has just put into the chat for all of you to respond, to give us some feedback on this event. And with that, I would like to thank all of you and have a good evening.